2 years after the murder of 31-year-old Viwe Dalingozi, her boyfriend Mpho has been sentenced to 20 years behind bars. Dalingozi died from severe burns after Thobane had set her alight in her flat in Johannesburg in October 2018. Prosecutors say Thobane had accused Dalingozi of being in contact with her former boyfriend. During sentencing proceedings, the Johannesburg Magistrates Court described him as a cold-blooded killer. Well, of course, gender-based violence continues unabated in South Africa, despite a growing number of successful convictions in the courts. According to the United Nations, GBV is one of the most prevalent human rights abuses in the world that knows no social, economic or national boundaries. Now, suggestions have been made that South Africa needs stronger political will to invest resources and programs aimed at preventing femicide. To discuss this further, I'm joined by gender-based violence activist and researcher at the University of Johannesburg, Lisa Vetten. Lisa, good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time. When we look at the issue of gender-based violence and the progress that has been made over the last couple of years, has there been follow-through, at least on the part of government? We've seen the president talking tough on gender-based violence and making firm commitments to supporting the fight. Has it been backed up with the money?
That's very hard to say, Kathy. I think, we looked at that emergency response fund that was given out shortly after Ian and where Tana's were murder. That seems to be money taken from existing budgets, with a little bit of extra taken from where departments hadn't spent their money. What's going to be really, really important is to see what's going to happen when you see the estimates of national expenditure, as well as the provincial budgets that are due to be released in the next couple of weeks. We heard Minister Mboweni speaking about the serious cuts to budgets and the tight strain that the fiscus is under. So I think we will see in the fine print of what's going to department for what kinds of projects. That's where we're going to need to look to see whether or not that money is actually available, or whether the government is just trying to slide past on the fact that there are a certain number of police officers are always going to be need to be employed, so we'll just count the number of police officers and say, well, they'll all be doing some gender-based violence work, so there's our budget.
Of course, when one looks at the latest figures, the crime statistics that show what the later part of last year, what happened in the later part of last year, one certainly doesn't get a sense that this fight is being won at all.
Kathy, there are two ways to look at it. The one is to take the long view, and that's the historical view. So if you look at the figures from 1990, from the 90s, that decade very violent. Since then, we have halved the number of women who are dying at the hands of their male partners, and rape, once you control for increases in the size of the population, is probably between a quarter to a third fewer rapes being reported now than there were during the 1990s. So if we take the long view, then it does look as if we are making some impact. However, I think for those living now or who are fearful now, clearly they'd like to see it reduced even more. And here's where we need to think about what else is it that we need to do. And I don't know if we're necessarily drawing the kinds of lessons we need to do from the last 30 years, because clearly we have been doing something that is working. But I wonder if anyone can even say what that something was. So before we jump to doing new things or dismantling old things, we need to be very, very sure about what it is that's working and what is not working. And I don't think we actually have the answers to that. Our statistics are just not of a quality.
Yeah. When you look at part of what the figures are showing us, again, from the crime statistics over the lockdown period, what is it that you draw about the patterns of gender-based violence under lockdown?
There are a couple of different patterns you can draw. The first is that violence was artificially reduced. Well, it appears artificially reduced because I think not necessarily because violence was reduced, but because there were such barriers in terms of leaving your house in order to get to the police station. It's possible that certain kinds of rapes were reduced. So stranger rapes, where somebody breaks into your house, or where you are raped on the way to public transport, for example, because of the restrictions on movement, it's possible that that was reduced. But I think if you start looking at the figures from about August last year, so in fact the increase started before the minister just gave his most recent figures, you can certainly see the figures for murder and assault GBH going up, where you will find a lot of domestic violence. And now we've seen rape join that trend. But what is really concerning is that though the figures overall are still lower than last year, as of August last year, they were higher than the previous year. So you actually started seeing an increase as the lockdown eased over previous years. That's very worrying, and we need to ask what prompted that. Were we seeing the effects of some of the economic conditions and changes and hardships and difficulties driving those increases in violence? If that is correct, we're certainly a long way out of the woods in terms of unemployment and a bad economic condition. What is that perhaps telling us about the future and how violence may or may not increase in South Africa? So I think those statistics are pointing to trends we don't properly understand, and we should be trying to understand, because they might be telling us about the start of something that could be potentially long-term rather than just an artifact of a few months of lockdown, for example.
And of course, one of the things that we're also going to see this year and probably over the next couple of years is some serious budget cuts when it comes to spending, and some of that will almost inevitably affect social spending, especially where budgets are being reprioritized. At this point, do you know what impact this tight budget is going to have on the fight against gender-based violence and the programs that government is running?
Well, I think we're going to have to wait to see what happens when the provincial equitable share is distributed to the provinces. But it's already apparent in the Department of Social Development's budget at national level, to national level NGOs. That budget that's given to NGOs who will be doing, some of whom will be doing GBV work, not all necessarily, has been halved. So it's been reduced from over 90 million to about 46 million. That is deeply concerning, and it does make one worry what we're going to see when we start looking at what the provinces have gotten. And the point is, social services provided by NGOs are very easy to cut. NGOs have no claim to be able to go to government and to the Labour Court or the Constitutional Court demanding increases. So historically, when government has needed to cut budgets, it's cut the NGO budget, because they rely on the fact that NGOs are committed, they'll work for nothing, or they'll try and make another plan. Government officials will not do that.
Yeah, it's putting NGOs in an incredibly difficult position, and a lot of them are already under incredible strain. Lisa Vetten is a gender-based violence activist and researcher with the University of Johannesburg.